Hello, part 2 of the Link Services and Proxy API series. There's 6 videos in this series. This is the second one. It's basically focusing on some of the integration mechanics between ShareDo and upstream services and how these things called the Link Services and Proxy API can effectively help you get around some of the common problems that you would have in those kinds of integrations. Today we're going to just have a quick tour of link services, and we're going to use the Proxy API to effectively integrate ShareDo with GitHub. So let's jump straight in. I'm going to sign into ShareDo, and I'm going to go to my admin tool. On the left hand side there's an integration section, and part of the integration section is manage link services. Everything that you see within ShareDo, so your DMS integrations, calendar integrations, integration with DocuSign and stuff, you'll see those represented in Managed Link Services. Everything that we integrate upstream to typically comes through this plumbing to benefit from all of that stuff that I've described in the last video, like token management and configuration management and things like that. But what we're going to do today is going to add a new service. It's going to be the GitHub service. When you click the add button, it gives you a list of all of the different service providers that we support out of the box. Some of them are very specific, like Contract Express and I Manage Work, DocuSign, but some of them are also generic, like Shared Secret. And if you scroll down to the bottom, we've got all of the standard OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect integrations, including authorization code flow, which is the authentication mechanism that GitHub uses. So to add GitHub, I'm obviously going to create one based upon the authorization code grant. And this gives me a generic form for setting up any auth code flow service. So I'm going to give it a name. So it's going to be called GitHub. I'll give it an icon, which I believe we've got a GitHub one. Yes, we do. Give it a title, GitHub integration. That's the standard stuff that you will create for every different type of service, but then the rest of the configuration is specific to the auth code flow. So this looks a bit confusing. We're asking for client ID, client secret, authorization endpoint. These are all of the generic parameters for any OAuth service. And on the GitHub API documentation, when you go and register an application for integration, it will give you this information. So I've already pre-registered one against my account, which I'll just cut and paste the values in. So I've got this weird client ID. I've got this client secret, which I won't show you. I will be deleting this particular client from my account once I finish recording the videos. Then we've got to tell it what the authorization endpoint is. And this is the URL that we all send users to basically sign in to confirm that they are a GitHub user, and to consent to allow ShareDo to call GitHub on their behalf. Once they've finished with the authorization endpoint and they've consented, it then sends us a response called an authorization code, which we then call from the server. We make a call to the token endpoint to exchange that authorization code for something called an access token. And it's the access token that is the piece of security information that actually says when it's presented to GitHub, GitHub will validate it and go, yes, you are allowed to call my APIs, and yes, you are this particular user. So I need to copy that across, which is again from the GitHub documentation. And then scope, so basically saying what do I want to allow this application to do. So I can define my application in GitHub with a whole bunch of different scopes. But all I'm actually interested in this time is I'm interested in who the user is. I just want to validate that they are a valid user, so that when I call the GitHub APIs using this service, it will present this user, whoever I link in a second, to GitHub as a valid user. Then we come into some of the token management stuff. So fallback to system tokens basically says with any of these registrations, you can make them available to individual users. So you can say, I'm registering the GitHub service, but I'm not going to give it a system token. I'm not going to link ShareDo itself. I'm going to force individual users to link their own personal GitHub accounts. And then whenever ShareDo wants to talk to GitHub, it'll do it on behalf of whoever the current user is. What you can do do in those scenarios is you can say, if somebody doesn't have their own account linked, do I want to allow it to fall back to a system token, so like a service account. In this case, I'm not interested in making users link their own GitHub account. I'm just going to create a standard link, and I'll use that same account everywhere. So I'll say yes to allowing fallback to system tokens. Then the API parameters is the configuration of how ShareDo will actually talk to the API that we want to call. So the base URL is where is the URL that we want to call. So for GitHub, that will not change between environments, but hopefully you can see here that this is where you would change the URL for your upstream services as you moved between environments. So the GitHub one is api.github.com. Now, HTTP header to send the token in. You can configure this, so you could put something like, this won't work for GitHub, but you could say I'm going to send that in the header x custom auth, and I'm going to prefix whatever the actual token is that I send with token. So what that would be configuring is what HTTP header I need to send and how I need to prefix the token if I need to at all. Now, the defaults in OAuth are to send the HTTP header in the standard authorization header, and the standard prefix for a token is bearer. It's what they call a bearer token. So I don't actually need to set these at all. It'll just do that by default for me because this is a standard OAuth flow. This is the bit where I can make it available to users. So if I wanted all employees on my system to link their own GitHub account, I would do that, and I could mark it as required, and it will nag them to start linking the GitHub account. I'm not going to do that though. I'm just going to link a system account. And again, if I was enabling that for the team, I can customize the link messages that appear. So these are the actual nag messages that the users would see. Now this is the important bit in terms of the proxy. So I can leave this switched off, and no matter how hard I try using the proxy API, I will not be able to call this GitHub service. The only thing that would be able to call this GitHub service would be internal C# code running on the server, and it wouldn't be going through the proxy. It would just be able to use the service, get tokens, and then call the APIs using server-side code. So in order to enable this for use in the UI or within workflow, I need to enable the proxy, and that basically exposes anything that's in the GitHub APIs, but against the ShareDo APIs using this type of URL. So /API proxy, the name of the service that we are creating, which is GitHub, and then the proxy URL is what is the upstream API URL that you want to call, but without this bit, because we're going to take that from the configuration. Now, there's a couple of other things we need to know about here, and that is when you send a request via the proxy, you'll be sending all kinds of HTTP headers to ShareDo. It will strip all of those off by default. It will add in the appropriate authorization header and then call the service. And similarly, when the GitHub service replies to us, it will strip off all of the HTTP headers that it got back from GitHub and just send you back the raw response. Now, when we make a call from ShareDo up to GitHub, I know for a fact that GitHub expects a certain header, which is the user agent header. So I'm going to allow that to be forwarded on. So instead of stripping user agent off, it will leave that in place, and it just basically tells you what browser you're using. And I'm not going to do anything with the headers in the reply. They're just going to all get stripped off. So the only thing that's actually going to go upstream from the server here, we're going to go from ShareDo to the proxy API. The proxy API is going to strip off all of those headers except user agent. Then it's going to add the appropriate authorization header in after it's done any token exchange and things like that on your behalf. Then it's going to send that up to GitHub from the server. GitHub is then going to reply to the server, and all of its headers are going to get stripped off as well before it's sent back to the UI or the workflow. And hopefully, if I've configured that correctly, we've now got this GitHub service. Now, but I've not linked it yet, so there is no account linkage between ShareDo and GitHub. It's literally, I've just created the service container and its configuration. You can see that here. It says the configuration is valid, but I've got no token linked. It's not available to any users, but the proxy is enabled. If I click the little I button, it tells me what my current status is. This is quite a technical screen, and depending upon which service type you've registered, it can have a lot more information in there. And you can see I don't have a refresh token, don't have an access token, I don't have an account linked, but it does allow fallback to whatever the system token is if we make a call to the Proxy API as a user and the user doesn't have an account linked, it will fall back to whatever we link globally. Okay, so what I need to do now is link it. So I'm going to click the link button, and that's now going to pop up with some stuff I don't need. Okay, in fact, I'm going to do that again because that was just GitHub confirming some of my own personal account recovery stuff. Let's do that again, link. So what it's doing now, I'm already signed into GitHub. So it already knows who I am. If I wasn't signed in, it would first of all ask me to sign in. I would sign in and then I would see this screen. So this is called a consent screen. So this is GitHub now. GitHub is saying, hey, this application, ShareDo, wants to use the APIs on behalf of you, the signed in user, which for me is Tony. Do you want to allow access of ShareDo to call the GitHub APIs on your behalf? So I can say no, in which case my account's not linked. Otherwise I can say yes, and you can see here I've also got some stuff to do with the organizations that I'm a member of, so Sliced Bread and ShareDo Tech, and I can grant permission to those organizations as well. Because I'm only interested in the user data at the moment, if I had additional scopes, there would be additional information listed up here. Because I'm only interested in the user information, I don't really need to make any changes. I can just say, yes, I authorize for my account to be used by ShareDo. I just need to do my two-factor authentication. 1 second, I'm going to pause while I've... Okay, well, what you didn't see there, because I didn't want to leak my authorization code, was two-factor authentication kicked in. I checked my phone and I then allowed it to continue linking. Let me see if I can unlink that and do it again so you can see the end-to-end flow. So I'm going to unlink and I'll link again. I would have got the consent screen, but because I've already consented, it's now gone straight into allowing my account to be linked. If I go and inspect that, you can see that I now have an access token. Now, GitHub doesn't advertise the name of the linked account, so this particular status, because it's a generic provider, it's the OAuth provider, it doesn't think there's an account linked. It's not that there's no account linked, it's that GitHub hasn't told us the name of the account. But we do have an access token, and it doesn't expire. We don't have a refresh token, so it's not going to use the refresh flow as part of the authorization code flow to get new access tokens. Basically, the access token that I've just been given is a permanent access token. I would revoke it by either unlinking the account or by going into my GitHub account and revoking it from there. So hopefully we can now use this to go and test the proxy. So assuming I wanted ShareDo to go and call GitHub now to get some information, I can do this. I'm just going to do it from the developer console. So this just gives me access to all of the client-side UI API stuff, which if you've developed any custom widgets or anything like that, you're probably familiar with. So one of the things we've got access to is this thing called $Ajax that allows me to go and make calls to the ShareDo APIs, and it will do all of the appropriate security stuff to call the ShareDo APIs. So I can ask it to go and get me something from the proxy. So that will be API proxy GitHub. So that's the name of this service that we registered. So here I'm saying, hey, GitHub. If I go into the actual configuration details, the system name is GitHub. Yep. So that's the unique identifier of that particular service. Okay. So I'm saying go call the proxy API for the service GitHub, and then we have a little underscore, and now the rest of this is the URL on the GitHub service that I want to call. So I want to look at a certain organization, so orgs/ShareDo-tech, ShareDo-tech, which is our the ShareDo GitHub organization. I want to look at what repos we've got available. That's it. I'm making a GET request to the GitHub link service. I'm not passing any security information. I'm not telling it how to authenticate to GitHub. All of that's been taken care of by the link service plumbing. And then when that request completes, I'm just going to log it to the console. And there we go. We get a response from GitHub, with the 6 repositories that are associated to the ShareDo tech organization. So we've got some auth code samples, a sample mobile app, the mobile core framework, some IDE samples, API samples, and very soon there'll be another one in there, which is the GitHub samples that accompany this video series. So to quickly recap, we have registered a service within ShareDo for GitHub. We've set up all of the generic OAuth parameters to allow that service to be linked. We've then linked an account, my personal account, to ShareDo, and then we've demonstrated the use of the ShareDo Proxy API to effectively route a request not to GitHub directly from the UI, but via the Proxy API, where it can take care of all of the security concerns, all of the configuration concerns, and then forward the request onto GitHub to get the response to send it back to the UI. Which is this. So instead of this scenario where we're trying to call GitHub directly from the ShareDo UI to the external API, we're now doing it this way. We've registered that service in the linked services, exposed it via the proxy, and we've made the call from one to the other, and it's looked after all of those difficult things for us. Just want to show you one more thing. Let's go back to my browser. I'm going to repeat this, but just to show that that proxy API is quite secure in its own right. If I disable the proxy on that service and try to repeat that request that I've just sent, you can see I now get a 400 response saying that the proxy is disabled for service GitHub. So I can't just start arbitrarily poking these services that I might have configured for my DMS and things like that. It won't allow them to be proxied unless you specifically tell it to allow the proxy to happen. Okay, so that's it for part 2. In the next one, we are going to look at the wider scenario that we're going to use to actually demonstrate this in a little bit more detail. We're going to look at the API that we've built to simulate an upstream service that's secure using a API key, and we're going to have a look at the code that makes all that up. We're going to use look at the Swagger definitions for that API, and we're going to basically poke the API with nothing to do with ShareDo. We're going to use Postman to just start manipulating some data. That's it for now though, thanks.